When I was young, our neighbors had a key to our house, and we had one to theirs, hanging on a hook by each of our own back doors, without either family ever making a formal decision about it or discussing it as though it were anything unusual at all, the way you might discuss something that actually required thought or hesitation. Nobody signed anything, nobody drew up an agreement, or exchanged a single word about liability or trust. It simply happened, the way most of what I'm about to describe simply happened, without a meeting or an announcement, because that was just how a street full of houses ran back then, quietly and without much ceremony, one small assumption of goodwill stacked on top of another, until an entire way of living together had formed almost by accident. I've spent the past several months trying to bring some of that back into my own neighborhood, and here are 15 habits that made it work, along with what actually happened when I tried reviving each one myself. Sometimes clumsily, sometimes with more success than I expected going in. The key exchange was the first thing I brought back, nervous as I felt asking a neighbor I genuinely liked but didn't know especially well at that point, standing on her porch rehearsing the request in my head before I ever knocked. I explained I'd feel better knowing someone close by could get in if something ever happened. A burst pipe, a forgotten stove left on, anything at all that couldn't wait for me to drive back from wherever I happened to be. She agreed without a second thought, seemingly relieved I'd asked before she had to, and within a week, she'd asked for the same arrangement with the family on her other side. It spread 3 houses down the block since then, a small chain of trust that started with one slightly awkward conversation on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Borrowing tools instead of buying them for a single use was something I remembered clearly from childhood, my father walking next door for a ladder or a specific wrench rather than owning one himself for a job that came up once every few years and never again after that. I started doing the same. Asking around before buying anything I'd only need occasionally, feeling a little sheepish the first few times I knocked with a request. I've been genuinely surprised how often the answer is yes, along with an offer of advice on how to actually use whatever I was borrowing, sometimes even an offer to come help with the job itself. Checking on an older neighbor regularly, not waiting for an emergency to prompt it, was a habit that used to be simply assumed on most streets, nobody needing to be asked or reminded to do it in the first place. I started walking 2 doors down every few days to see a widower in his 80s. Nothing formal, just a knock and a few minutes of conversation on his porch, about the weather or whatever happened to be on his mind that day. He told me recently it's become the part of his week he looks forward to most, which struck me harder than I expected it to when he actually said it out loud to me, sitting there on his front step. Welcoming a new family with something homemade, rather than simply waving from a distance and letting them settle in entirely on their own over those first disorienting weeks, was a small tradition I brought back the moment I noticed moving boxes going into the house across the street one Saturday morning. A loaf of bread still slightly warm, a short note with my phone number in case they needed anything at all before they'd even finished unpacking their kitchen. They knocked on my door 2 days later just to say thank you, standing there a little uncertain until I invited them in for coffee, and we've been genuinely friendly ever since, in a way that might never have started without that first small gesture on my part. It's worth pausing here for a moment, because I think this is the part that's actually hardest to bring back. Harder than any single habit on its own, no matter how simple it sounds in the retelling. Harder even than the awkwardness of the first knock on an unfamiliar door. All of this depends on a kind of trust that has to be extended first, before it's ever earned, which feels like a real risk in a way it apparently didn't used to feel to my grandmother's generation, raised on a very different assumption about the people living around them. My grandmother's generation simply assumed goodwill from the people living around them until given a specific reason not to, a default setting of trust rather than suspicion, extended freely and revised only when something actually happened to justify revising it. We've mostly flipped that assumption around somewhere along the way, quietly, without ever really deciding to as a society, one locked door and one drawn curtain at a time, and I think that shift, more than any single habit on this entire list, is the real thing worth examining honestly, if any of this is going to actually work for longer than a single well-intentioned season. Sharing childcare informally, one family watching a neighbor's children for an hour, so the other parent could run an errand or handle something unexpected, without any money changing hands or a formal arrangement being discussed in advance, was something I remember constantly growing up, almost too ordinary to have noticed at the time. I started offering the same to a young family 2 houses down, and it took some genuine convincing before they felt comfortable accepting my offer, which told me something important about how unusual and slightly suspicious the offer has become to people, even when it's clearly meant kindly and welcomed once they finally said yes. A shared toolshed, or at least a shared understanding of who owned what across the whole block, meant nobody on the street needed to own a ladder, a post hole digger, and a pressure washer all at once, each item sitting unused in a garage for 50 weeks out of the year, taking up space and slowly rusting. A few of us have started keeping an informal list now, just a shared note on our phones that anyone can add to, of who has what available to lend, so a borrowed item is only ever a text message away rather than an unnecessary trip to a rental counter and an unnecessary rental fee besides. Walking children to school together, several families combining into one small group rather than each parent driving separately, or a child walking entirely alone down quiet streets, was something that happened almost automatically on my own street growing up. No formal arrangement ever discussed among the parents. A few of us have started doing the same now, taking turns leading the walk on different mornings so no single parent bears the whole responsibility every day, and the children have started genuinely looking forward to it, treating it more like a small daily adventure than a chore anyone has to be convinced or bribed into doing. Hosting a block party at least once a year, nothing elaborate, folding tables set up in the middle of the street with a permit nobody used to think twice about getting from the city, was something that used to happen almost without anyone specifically organizing it or taking charge. I took it on myself this past summer, genuinely unsure anyone would actually show up when I first started asking around and knocking on doors with flyers I'd made myself. Nearly every house on the block came out for at least part of the afternoon. Folding chairs dragged out onto lawns and driveways, several people telling me afterward it was the first time they'd properly met a neighbor they'd been living beside for years, without ever once actually speaking to them. Letting children play in the street or a shared yard with looser supervision than feels comfortable now, several sets of parents keeping a general eye out together, rather than one parent watching constantly and alone all afternoon, was simply how most afternoons worked when I was young. Doors left open, kids drifting between yards. I've eased into something closer to that with a few families nearby, an agreement that any adult outside is watching for any child outside regardless of whose child it happens to be, and it's given the parents on our street real breathing room they didn't have before, along with children who've become genuinely close with kids beyond just their own immediate age group and their own backyard fence. Borrowing a genuine cup of sugar, or an egg, or whatever small ingredient came up short mid-recipe, instead of stopping everything to drive to a store for one single item, was such an ordinary occurrence growing up that I'd nearly forgotten it was ever a real practice, rather than just an old expression people say without meaning it literally. I've done it twice myself this year, apron still on, knocking on a neighbor's door mid-recipe with flour still on my hands, and both times it led to a longer conversation than the ingredient itself ever warranted, standing in a doorway talking for 20 minutes about nothing in particular while whatever I was cooking waited. A shared understanding about noise, mowing schedules, and general everyday consideration worked out through simple, direct conversation rather than a formal complaint or an anonymous note left on a windshield, used to keep most disagreements small and easily resolved before they ever had a chance to grow into something bigger. When a new neighbor's dog started barking early one morning, waking me before my alarm most days that week, I simply walked over and mentioned it directly, gently, rather than letting the resentment build silently for weeks, the way it so easily could have. It was fixed within days, a bark collar and a change in the dog's routine, and we've been on genuinely good terms ever since, which might not have happened at all if I'd let it fester into something colder instead of just saying something plainly. Helping with a bigger project, painting a fence, moving something heavy, clearing storm debris after a bad week of weather, without waiting to be specifically asked first, was a habit that used to define a decent neighbor more than almost anything else on this entire list, more than any single gesture on its own. I've started simply showing up when I notice a need, offering rather than waiting for a request that might never actually come because someone felt too proud or too uncertain to ask for help outright. I've been met every single time with genuine surprise followed by real, visible gratitude, sometimes a little embarrassed gratitude, as though the offer itself was unexpected in a way it never should have become. And the last one is simply learning names, actual first names, for everyone within a reasonable distance of my own front door, rather than the vague, nodding acquaintance most of us settle for now, without really noticing we've settled for it at all. I made a small effort over the past few months to actually ask when I didn't know, to genuinely remember afterward rather than letting it slip within the hour, and to use a name the next time I saw someone, rather than a generic wave from across the street or a mumbled hello that could have been meant for anyone. It's changed something in how the whole block feels to walk through now, less like a collection of separate houses standing quietly next to each other, and more like an actual neighborhood, which I suppose is the entire point of everything else on this list, all 14 other habits ultimately pointing back toward this same simple thing. None of this happened overnight, and I want to be honest that a few of these attempts felt genuinely awkward before they ever felt natural, standing on a doorstep second-guessing whether I was overstepping some invisible boundary nobody else on the street seemed to be observing quite as carefully as I was worried about. There was a week, fairly early on, when I nearly gave up on the whole idea entirely, embarrassed after a somewhat stilted conversation with a neighbor I barely knew, wondering if I was simply making things uncomfortable rather than actually building anything real. But a year in, my street feels genuinely different to walk down than it did before I started any of this, warmer in a way that's hard to fully explain to someone who hasn't felt the shift themselves, something you notice more in the absence of it than while it's actually happening around you. A neighbor I've grown particularly close with this past year told me something recently that stuck with me since. She said she'd lived on this street for nearly a decade before any of this started, nodding politely at the same handful of people the entire time, without ever once learning a single name beyond her immediate next-door neighbors. She said it hadn't occurred to her that anything was missing until it wasn't missing anymore, until she actually had it, and only then did she realize how much quieter and more isolated those first 10 years had actually felt by comparison, even surrounded by houses full of people the whole time. If any of this sounds like something missing from your own street, it might be worth starting with just one small thing rather than trying to take on this entire list at once, the way I nearly did myself in the beginning. A key exchanged, a name finally learned, a tool offered before it's even asked for. Small things, most of them, almost embarrassingly small when you list them out like this, but they add up to something larger than any single one of them ever suggests on its own, the same way a whole neighborhood is really just a collection of small, ordinary choices, repeated often enough, by enough people, until they finally become something worth actually calling a community.